really deals with kind of 5 pieces. The first is about reconnecting with the promise, about why we get into this particular job to begin with, and then we're going to look at kind of what it looks like for you as you develop your practice. So we're going to look at the notion of mastery and what does mastery really look like as a classroom teacher. What's the purpose that's driving your work? How is it that you exercise autonomy in really improving your practice? And then how it is that you get support as you move through this. So the first piece we're going to start with is just kind of reconnecting with the promise. And as you think about it, and I know when I became a classroom teacher in 1977, and certainly the teachers that we spent time with, they're in this profession to transform kids' lives. They talk often about kind of nurturing a passion for learning and really making a difference in the world. And I think this is common to most of us that are in this profession. But the reality today is that with high-stakes testing, with kind of a perceived loss of public trust and standing with respect to being a teacher, constantly changing standards, and there are a lot of things that kind of get in the way of the dream that I think we all have as we enter the profession. So what we'd like to do here is just show a little bit of data that has come out of primarily Gallup's work, especially around their workforce poll that they do every other year. And what came out of that poll was really interesting. If you looked at teachers, and there were about 7,200 teachers that responded to this poll, and about 70,000 total folks from 14 different occupations. When you look at how teachers answered the questions, about 31% of them are kind of highly engaged in the work. About 56%, over half of teachers by Gallup standards, are not engaged. Now, this does not mean they're not satisfied with their job or anything else. It just means that they're likely not devoting a lot of discretionary time to improve the practice. And when you look at the difference between those folks that they classify as engaged and those that they don't, the difference is really about kind of improving your practice. People that are really engaged in the work are constantly improving their practice. And then there's also a group of teachers, about 13% according to Gallup's data, who are actively disengaged. And they may not only be kind of dissatisfied with their work, but they may also be spreading negativity to their coworkers. Now, when you think about what drives improvement, I think it's really critical to think about this whole issue of kind of where we are right now. So from the point of view of administrators or from teachers, I think the real challenge is how do we begin to move that group of people who like their jobs and are connected with them, but are not really engaged at the level where they're constantly looking for new and better ways. Because as we studied highly effective teachers, that was one of the hallmarks of that group, is they constantly talked about how do I get better, how do I do better than I did yesterday. So when we think about engagement and why it may be that only about 30% of teachers are engaged, there's some other data that also came out of this report I think that's really interesting. Teachers of the 14 job types that were represented in the survey, teachers talked about the highest level of stress among any of those, and that included nurses, doctors, salespeople, lots of other job applications, and many of them cited high-stakes testing as a major cause for why they're feeling high levels of stress. And also, and I think especially troubling for me, teachers were the least likely of those 14 job groups to agree with the statement, "At work, my opinion seems to count." So with teachers, I think in general, they're feeling stressed, they're feeling isolated, and they're feeling disempowered. And I mean, it's no wonder that over half of teachers are feeling a bit disengaged from the work. I think on the up note, when you look at the number and the percentage of teachers who are engaged in the work, it's actually higher than in most of the other job categories that are out there. But 31% is still not enough to really talk about everything getting better. So the question is, how do we help teachers to reconnect with the promise and really re-engage their own development and in fact kind of own their own development? And again, there's been a lot of research over the last 20 years, and what has come out of that is that most organizations, including schools, really get motivation wrong. And again, most schools, especially with their evaluation systems, kind of emphasize classic kind of behavioral carrots and sticks, punishments and rewards and things like that. And those work in the short term, but they don't tend to work in the long term. And according to Daniel Pink, who really pulled together a lot of the research that has happened over the last several years, what really drives us is having a sense of mastery over our work. That is, knowing what it means to operate at a high level and continuing to work to get to that place. A clearly defined sense of purpose, a sense of there being something bigger than yourself that you're looking for. And again, with the teachers we worked with, the notion of transforming kids' lives was a very large part of their purpose. And then finally, the capacity to exercise autonomy is really critical for motivation. And again, with much of what's happened around evaluation, I think teachers are feeling less and less autonomous in their work. So to really move the dial in terms of getting more teachers engaged in thinking about their practice in powerful ways, we've got to bring some aspect of autonomy back to all of that work.
So before we move on to the next section, let's just pause and see if we have any questions, and if not, then we'll move on to beginning to talk about mastery and purpose and autonomy.
Yes, we do have one question from Gail, and she asked, how do administrators support teachers without perceiving the support as a got you activity? And then she continues, as you mentioned, with high stakes testing, how can teachers achieve a sense of autonomy when everything is beginning to be so scripted?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's a lot of what we're working on with our practice. And in one sense, I believe that, you know, as teachers, we have to kind of take back what rightfully belongs to us. And so with all of the things going on, and again, one of the things that we heard clearly from these great teachers that we spent time with was, even in spite of everything going on, they still trust their own kind of judgments about what it is, you know, what's in the best interest of kids. And so they really took autonomy even in a case where it's kind of hard to have autonomy. And I think with the work that we're doing with teachers right now, they do have a lot of autonomy in terms of actually selecting what it is, what aspect of their practice they're working on. So I think as we move through this, there will be some more things that really address that question.
And specifically thinking about it from a principal or administrative point of view, I mean, one thing we've heard from school districts that we've worked with in the past is that it does take a little bit of a leap of faith, because it involves kind of letting go some of the things you might normally manage or control. And we're going to be talking also about what support might look like from a principal or administrative role when we get a little bit later in the presentation, and some of the questions you can ask that come from a more supportive angle as opposed to more of a directive angle. So we'll definitely hit those a little bit later in the presentation. So if there's no more questions, really what we want to spend the next chunk of this webinar talking about are really some strategies for getting at mastery, purpose, and autonomy. And you can think of that both as a teacher, how can you do this for yourself, and as an administrator, how can you create that space for your staff, and also for your own development as a leader, because we've done work with principals as well. So again, as we think about mastery, there's really a lot of parallels between adult learning and learning for children. You need to start with, what does mastery look like? So what does it mean to teach at a really high level? Creating that kind of clear learning target and building a common understanding around what does it mean to become a master teacher. And we've spent, as Mike mentioned, about 6 years working with teachers who are getting incredible classroom gains. So we used classroom level value-added information to identify teachers that have been getting really high gains year after year with their students, and brought them together in several ways. And one way was workshops, also in focus groups and extended one-on-one interviews. And the types of questions we really asked them was adopting an appreciative interview or inquiry point of view in terms of, what does your classroom look like on its very best days? What's taking place? Describe your classroom practice. Describe what you're doing to build a positive culture for learning in your classroom. And really digging into deep to what does it look like on your very best day in the classroom. And in terms of bringing those teachers together, it involved more than 350 teachers, teachers from grades 4 through 12, and also in all the core subject areas. So that would be math, reading, science, and social studies. And what we heard kind of surprised us because we didn't hear a lot of content-specific or grade-level specific strategies. Really what we heard was these common themes that came out over and over again. And the first one that came out very clearly was this notion of having trusting relationships. My students need to know that I care deeply for them. They need to feel supported in their learning. They need to be part of owning their own learning. So really cultivating this supportive learning community. The second theme that we heard over and over again was continuous improvement, and this was really from two different perspectives. The first was, as Mike mentioned, these teachers looking at their own practice and looking for ways to constantly get better, to constantly push their learning forward. But the second way they spoke about continuous improvement was really about living in the moment of their classroom. So being very responsive and tuning into their students and making changes on the fly in their classroom, adapting things when things weren't working, dropping what they had planned and moving in a different direction if that's what their students needed that particular day. The third theme that came through was high expectations. So taking a look at each student and where they entered at the beginning of the year and doing everything they could to maximize that student's growth throughout the year. And then the final piece we heard was the importance of having a stable classroom environment. So creating that place where students could come and they knew what was expected of them. They felt safe there. They had rules, routines, things that really gave them a sense of what was coming and what they needed to be doing to be successful in that environment. And the other piece that was really interesting to us is that we made the connection between what these teachers were saying and an organizational framework that's been around for more than 30 years. And that's actually how we got connected to Bob Quinn, one of the co-authors of the book. This is a framework that came out of his research back in 1983. And he actually had been studying highly effective organizations. So what do the best performing organizations do? And those exact same 4 themes came out. There needs to be the sense of collaboration and morale, paying attention to those yellow things, the continuous improvement and creativity and adaptability in the green, the real focus on goals and outcomes and productivity in the blue, and also those stable structures and procedures that help keep things moving forward productively. The other important thing that this framework gave us was a way to connect those 4 themes. So they were no longer just 4 different important things. They're actually things that related and connected to one another. So we took that framework and just adapted some of the language in it to make it more comfortable and familiar to an educational context, and kept those same tensions as a way to talk about why is it difficult to do all 4 of these things. So if you look at that vertical tension, what you see is that down the red and the blue areas, it's really focusing on order and control. How do I create that structure and stability? But there also is important to think about flexibility and openness, and how do I stay open and receptive to new ideas and change when it's appropriate. And the other tension between these 2 things is on the horizontal dimension. So on one hand, I really need to pay attention to what's going on inside my organization, inside my classroom, what's going on with my students, what are those rules and structures. But at the same time, I can't ignore what's happening outside, those external things that are coming in, like state standards, like statewide assessments. Those things need to be incorporated in as well. But what was interesting for us was that despite those competing tensions, and that was the original name of the framework, Competing Values Framework, what we really heard over and over again from highly effective teachers is that they found a way to make all 4 of these things work together. So instead of it being either or, it became a both and. So they said things like, because my students know I love them, that's why they can work that's why they work so hard for me, that's why I can push them so hard, that's why they achieve at such a high level. They also told us things like, because I have these structures and procedures, that's why I can be so creative in my classroom. Students know where the boundaries are, and that allows us to be more creative in the work that we're doing together. So again, thinking about those connections and ways to make those things work together in a really synergistic way. The other really important thing that came out of Bob Quinn's work is understanding of what happens if we focus too heavily on any one area of that framework. So it's not a matter of taking any one of those 4 quadrants and trying to maximize it. Because if we focus too heavily on one thing, what actually happens is performance will start to decline. So if we look at that lower left and only are focusing on structures and rules and procedures, what we get is a frozen bureaucracy. Or you can think of it as the classroom where you go in, the kids look like zombies and their eyes are glazed over because everything is so scripted and proceduralized. And you can repeat this with any one of the 4 quadrants. As another example, if you think about the yellow quadrant and all you're ever driving is relationships and cooperation and collaboration and participation, you can get too much participation. School becomes, or the classroom becomes a place where it's so important that everyone's happy and getting along, that the learning isn't moving forward. So thinking about those things not just as a maximizing each individual one, but thinking about them in relationship to each other is really, really important. So as we again move back to that strategy for mastery and in terms of building a common understanding, I think the first piece that's really important from this work, it was very, very clear to us that great teachers are made and not born. And in our book, we actually use this framework as a way to share different stories of individual teachers' development across the course of their career. And also, the other thing that the Connect framework does is it really defines great teaching. So it talks about how there are 4 dimensions of highly effective teaching. It gives teachers a common language and understanding of what it means to be a good teacher, and a simple way to talk about that and what they're doing in the classroom. And it's also, again, important to note that really highly effective teachers don't talk about these things in isolation. They talk about integrating their practice across all 4 areas. And then the final piece of it that you can think about using this framework to drive for mastery is, again, about thinking about keeping those things in balance with one another. So if you're focusing too heavily on one area, that's when performance can start to decline. So it gives you a way to think about if things aren't working well in my classroom, what could be going on? And then also, it really provides a structure for reflection and experimentation. So beginning to understand what are my real strengths, where do I need to kind of stretch myself and grow my practice, and what are those small experiments or things that I can begin to do to move myself in that area. So again, before we move on to the next piece, thinking about your purpose, are there any questions about thinking about mastery or this part of the presentation?
We don't currently have any questions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. You'll have lots of other opportunities to ask questions. And I think the piece that Kate just talked about is really critical because it's that framework that's really is what we're constructing all the professional development around right now. Now, to look at the second piece that Daniel Pink talked a lot about is this sense of purpose. And the question here that I think is really critical is this question of who will I be with my students? And in terms of the work that we're doing with teachers right now, the key here is really to start with your strengths. As you think about your identity as a teacher, to really think about the strengths that you bring to the classroom. And so when we think about who the best teacher in you is, one of my favorite authors is Parker Palmer. Wrote a great book called The Courage to Teach, and really the theme of that entire book was this question of who will I be with my students. And as we talked to these great educators, we heard a lot of things from them that really kind of reiterated this theme. So one teacher talked a lot about finding your own way and that you can only be the best teacher in you when you're in fact doing what it is that's a part of your identity. A second teacher talked a lot about the temptation to try and kind of copy what other people are doing. But the point is that if you do that, the kids know that you're not being yourself and it just doesn't work. So I think the teachers that we spent time with were very clear about the connections of their identity and who they were with the kind of teachers they were. So from their perspective, and I think from our perspective as well, you have to ultimately be yourself if you're going to be a great teacher. So as we think about starting with strengths, there is an assessment that's available to you, and you may want to check out the website www.bfkconnect.org, and there is an assessment that's available for you to download, which will begin to give you a sense of, as you think of these 4 dimensions, where do you feel the most comfortable? What's the area that comes the most natural to you? And then the flip side of that is, which of these dimensions do I not visit very often? Which of these dimensions is the hardest for me to really integrate into my practice? So as you think about improving your practice, there are really a couple of different directions, and they're both important. But the first is the one that gets used more often than not, and it's really a problem-solving approach. And when we think about teacher evaluation, it's often focused on what you see here on the left side. So it's about, kind of what are you doing, but what are the problems with what am I doing, and what are the causes, and defining solutions. But the problem with that is it really approaches your practice from the perspective of there's something here that's not right, and because it's not right, I have to fix it. Now the other approach is one that we use with these teachers, and that is really part of the work that we're doing with teachers right now, is much more of an appreciative perspective. And instead of starting with what's not working, we start with teachers on what their strengths are, to really think about what am I good at and how do I leverage that? How do I make sure that that comes out loud and clear in my practice? So really starting with what's working as opposed to what's broken. And I think we'll stop there again for a quick minute and see if there's anything else that you have any questions about.
Still no questions have been submitted. We'd like to remind you, if you do have a question, feel free to enter it in the questions part, and I will read it off to Kate and Mike.
Okay, thank you. So the next piece we want to talk about is moving into that autonomy piece. And as a teacher, how can you create that sense of autonomy for yourself? And you can also think about this from the perspective as an administrator. How can I open up space for my teachers to be more autonomous? And really, we want to focus on how do we personalize learning. So getting at those, again, those things that are really important to our own craft, to our own practice, and making it better. So from an administrator perspective, that would be kind of helping teachers ask the questions about what they need to do, what they feel is important to grow their practice, rather than telling them this is what you need to work on. And we really use this framework with teachers at all different levels and levels of experience. And so starting out, what we see most common with beginning teachers is that in the beginning it's about really finding an identity. So as you look across these 4 areas, what feels like a natural fit or kind of a comfort zone or home that you could really start to build out and build your practice around. And what we heard from one of the teachers in our book, and I'll share his story as an example, was he had this natural sort of affinity towards the red quadrant. He felt very confident in his content knowledge. He felt confident in lesson planning and building out what he was going to do. But the particular skill that he struggled with was classroom management. And for his particular situation, he, as a student, had been an honors student, and his first teaching job was in a high school teaching to at-risk students who had very little interest or desire to learn math. And he was very close in age to them and felt very uncomfortable. So he really struggled with classroom management. This was a really difficult year for him. But fortunately for him, he had an administrator who really kind of took him under her wing, worked with him closely, and helped him develop that skill set and build out that part of his practice that was lacking. And then the next level is really moving from that strength that you have in one area and building it out. Because again, the danger is if you focus so heavily on that one particular quadrant, it's actually a detriment to your practice. And again, to share Aaron's story, he told us that early in his career he had a student who he really had a lot of negative behavioral issues with, was really focused hard on using his new classroom management skills, bringing the student under control, And by the end of the year, he really reached a point where he felt like he had gotten control of the student. The student wasn't kind of acting up and acting out in class. He was just kind of sitting quietly in the back of the room and not getting in the way of the learning. And he really felt like that was a huge win for him. You know, that was really a sign that he had really grown his practice. But then on the last day of class, that student actually came up to him and handed him a note and said, "I want to let you know that next year you're going to have my sister in your class, and I hope you don't give up on her the same way that you gave up on me." And for Aaron, that was really a pivotal moment in his career. That helped him realize that he couldn't keep all the focus on control and order in his classroom. He really needed to branch out and begin to incorporate those other dimensions of the practice. And what he actually told us is, "I had become so focused on gaining control of the student that I had damaged him as a person." So he moved out from that point to really begin to work on building better relationships with students. And that today is an area that he says he still tries to work on. So as you think about stretching outside your comfort zone, what we want you to think about is really how do you use your strengths to begin to work in those areas. So for Aaron, one thing that he does with his strength in the red quadrant is he sets up some routines, like standing at the doorway at the beginning of every class so that he can make those personal contacts and connections with students each and every day. If you're trying to stretch in the green, one approach might be to, again, set up those structures and processes for some more creative group activities so that when students move into those activities, they know what they're supposed to be doing and it doesn't feel quite so unpredictable and uncertain. If you're thinking about stretching into the blue area, one thing you can do, again, to focus on that achievement and high expectations is take a look at the scaffolding, how you're structuring the learning to make that, to create that learning pathway for students. And then at the very highest level, again, what we heard from highly effective teachers is they've really found a way to create a synergy between all four of those dimensions and connect them in really meaningful ways. So again, talking to Aaron today about his classroom management, it's a very different place from where it was when he started out in his career. And what we hear from him, saying is that he's moved away from it being a very teacher-centric, top-down control sort of classroom management to one that's very participatory. You know, students feel very free to interact with each other. There's still that recognition that he has a particular role and they have a role in the class, that they know that they can contribute. They don't feel afraid to contribute. They also don't feel afraid to push back on him at times. So if they say, you know, hey, I don't think that's the right answer, or I think there's a different way to approach this, they're very comfortable speaking up and pushing back and creating those types of conversations in the classroom. So as you think, again, what does it mean to really stretch your practice, to move beyond that area of strength? One way to think about it is departing from what comes naturally and easily. So it may feel a little bit uncomfortable to try some of these different things, especially the first time you're going out and doing something you haven't done before. We also hear a lot of teachers talk about confronting a fear or assumption in their practice. And again, just to give you an example of what that might look like, we had a teacher who was very strong in the yellow quadrant, so that relationship piece. And she told us, you know, around my school, I'm known as the teacher that students want to have. That's my identity as a teacher. I'm the teacher that everyone wants to have. So she was really uncomfortable doing the sort of red quadrant structure things. She didn't want to kind of be the enforcer of school policy because she was afraid that if she did those things, then her students wouldn't like her as much. She wouldn't be that teacher that everyone wanted to have anymore. But she realized that was really getting in the way of students learning, so she decided to set up a little experiment for herself. And what she did is she focused on one particular class where she was having an issue with students getting their phones out and texting during class. And she said, you know what, everyone needs to get their phones out, turn them off, and put them on their desk so I can see them. I don't want to see anyone on their phones anymore. And what she learned from that experience was that none of the students complained about it. None of them were grumbling or griping. They actually appreciated it because her students realized that it was getting in the way of their learning, and that allowed them to focus. She really, through that very simple, small experiment, she was able to kind of overturn that fear about being a little bit more strict and following through on some of the policies and things that these students needed to do for their own benefit of their own learning. The structured practice can also involve refining skills, and I talked about Aaron early in his career doing work in classroom management to really develop that piece of his practice. And it can also mean utilizing an area of strength in a new way, and I shared a few examples of that in terms of building out from the red quadrant to try some different things in the other quadrants. So those are all different ways to think about how do I begin to grow myself, how do I begin to build a practice that's a little bit broader and more well-rounded. And in terms of the particular strategy, as you think about stretching your practice, really we've built that around teacher-directed growth plans. So teachers really getting in touch with what are my strengths, where do I need to grow, and how do I begin to move myself in that direction through a lot of reflection and conversations and looking at different points of feedback. But again, thinking about some common pitfalls. What does it mean for teacher-directed growth plans? And the one thing we want to emphasize is that this shouldn't mean that teachers are going in a bubble and creating this plan in isolation without any feedback. While it is individualized and personalized, it should really be a collaborative process. And the way we've done this when we work with districts is to build the creation of the growth plan into the process of teachers working together and a professional learning team and coming together to look at their own data and talk about their practice and really refine where they feel like they need to work on their practice. And then also having some feedback from an administrative point of view during that process. And the other important thing to think about is that you really want to be very focused on what you're working on. Don't try and work on all the quadrants. Don't try and fix everything, because what happens when you're spread out too thin is that you don't accomplish anything and you become easily overwhelmed with trying to figure out what to do first. So we recommend, in terms of creating growth plan, to really focus in on that one quadrant and look at the attributes of that quadrant and pick one thing that could make the biggest impact on your practice. And that's not to say you should spend the entire year working on that one thing, but really focus in on that one thing, and then when you're ready, move on to the next thing. And then finally, don't compromise. This is really not about minimizing or giving up the things you're good at. It's thinking about using your strengths in different ways, and how do you continuously build on your strengths to broaden your practice. And I know earlier we had the question about what's the principal's role and how can I be supportive in this process. And when we work with teachers, this is how we work through, where they become familiar with the framework, they're assessing their practice, they're identifying the focus area and doing some experiments in the classroom. And we see the principals really playing a very important role in providing support during the identification of the area of focus and then also doing the work. So some principals have met with their teachers as they're developing this growth plan just to say, you know, give them a little nudge and say, you know what, I think this is a good area, but could you push yourself a little bit further? Could you go a little bit further? Are you really stretching yourself enough with this topic? Another great way to provide support, again, is just to ask, okay, I know this is what you're working on. What can I do to help you be successful? And it doesn't have to be the principal having the answers. It can be the principal helping making those connections. So if I want to stretch in the yellow quadrant, and I know as a teacher in my building that's incredible at building relationships with our kids, as an administrator, I can start to make those connections for my staff. And again, support the areas that they feel like they need to really work on. And then the last piece we want to go into is really building on that support piece. But before we move into that, are there any questions that have come in?
Yes, we've actually had quite a few. The first one comes from Brandon, and he asks, what would professional learning look like that capitalized on these three aspects?
Well, that's what that's actually what we're going to show you in the next segment in terms of what that looks like. But ultimately, for the work that we're doing with teachers now, it's really about a group of teachers coming together as a learning team, each of them kind of assessing their practice around these four quadrants and really getting at two things. Number one, where do I feel the most strong? What's the quadrant that's kind of serves as the base of my practice? And then, given that, where is it that I really need to stretch? And then each teacher, in essence, builds their own growth plan around that, but then they come together weekly to talk about this is what I'm doing, this is what I did in my classroom, this week, this is what happened. Does anybody have any feedback or any suggestions for how I might do this better or differently? And so what happens typically is that teachers come together, they start having these really rich conversations about practice, which at least in my experience as a middle school teacher, we had common planning time, but we almost never talked about our practice. So one of the great things here is that it really provides the right kind of space to have those kind of deeper conversations about your practice, and then conversations about how you can begin to stretch your practice and do things that you don't typically do. So again, we'll be talking about that more in this next segment, but clearly I think bringing people together is the key to this.
Okay, the next question comes from Robin, and it is, as an instructional coach, how do I assist teachers move their practice forward when I am building on strengths?
Well, I think one of the advantages of focusing on strengths is that it really builds energy and momentum to do things. And sometimes when you focus on what you do well and how you replicate it, you end up getting less of what's not going right or what you don't do well. So it's a different way to get at problem solving. But as Mike said in the beginning, it doesn't mean that sometimes there are issues and problems that we do need to focus on. It just doesn't have to be an either or. It can be a both and.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's really important is when people look at this framework and they see those 4 areas, one of the great things is as they look at those, they recognize an aspect of their practice that's really solid. So it's not about me being a bad teacher. It is that I am really good in an area, but I also need to stretch my practice in some other areas. So for everyone looking at this, there is an area of strength to build off of, as opposed to just starting with kind of that deficit mentality.
Okay. The next question comes from Gail again, and she asks, what do you say to a teacher who comes to you as an administrator, but you are not the direct supervisor? You want to help, but you don't want to step on your colleagues' toes.
Again, my sense of that is, I think support is what's really required to grow. And I think you can be a colleague and a support. I think one of the most difficult aspects that a principal has to face is how do I support teachers, and at the same time, how do I evaluate them? So those are 2 very difficult things to kind of hold together. But the point is that you need that supportive person. So again, I think giving people an opportunity to say, when I watched you teach, this is what I see. These are the great things I see in your practice. This is where I don't see you going very often. And with the framework, it provides a language to really talk about that. I think that's one of the things that we found early on as we were working with these great teachers. We asked them to talk about their practice, and they didn't know what to say. Once we kind of showed them, after the first couple of years, this framework that was developing, it was really easy for them to talk about their practice because they could talk about these 4 different dimensions or 4 different perspectives on teaching, and they could talk about best practices really in each of those areas. So really making that happen, but having those supports, I think, is critical, and I think you don't have to be an evaluator to provide that kind of support.
Okay, we had 2 questions come in from Edward. The first one is, joined 8 to 9 minutes into the presentation, so I may have missed the explanation of the phrase highly effective teacher, but would appreciate clarifying this as a reference point to the discussion. And then followed up with, the other question I have is about how these folks can position their work as a context of the so-called education reform movement reflected in Joel Klein's recent published book, which seems to be quite a bit at odds with the work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, I think we are, in fact, kind of moving against the grain, because one of the requirements of doing this kind of work is that there has to be a really high level of trust in your teachers, and so I think this is the piece that that I think is most important, and I think, you know, in talking to administrators, I think clearly everybody wants to, but there are all these forces kind of pushing from outside. But in terms of the other question, when we're talking about highly effective teachers here in this, we're really talking about teachers who produce large learning gains with students. So it was very specific in terms of the teachers that we identified. But I think you know, and as we started this research, we weren't sure what we would see when we were pulling a lot of high gain teachers together. But I think for both Kate and me, when you pull together teachers that produce large learning gains, you're seeing teachers that, you know, one of the things they're clear, these teachers say over and over, these are not drill and kill kind of people. These are not kind of lecture sorts of people. These are people who have a deep and abiding faith in kind of support and relationships, but also how it is that I can use those other aspects to really move my practice forward. So again, highly effective here means teachers that produce large gains, you know, when measured from the beginning of the year to the end of the year.
All right, we have two more, and then we'll let you continue out the next section. The first one, I'll read them both right now. The first one is from Charles, and he asks, what if you don't feel yourself growing despite putting forth the effort and being engaged? And Deidre asks, are there any steps to help an educator assist students to take more risk when they are afraid to try? The trust level is high, but there is a lack of know-how.
So the first one with regards to what if you're really engaged in trying but not seeing the gains, I think one of the questions is how are you trying to assess those gains? Because sometimes when we're working on something, it's not going to be a short-term result, or it's not going to translate necessarily to a test score. But some of the things we've heard teachers say, for example, we had a teacher that was really focused on the yellow quadrant, improving her relationships with students. So the types of things she was able to report was students are participating more in class. When I give a voluntary assignment, before students never would have taken advantage of it, and now even though it's not required for credit, they're coming and bringing it to me, and they're really excited to share what they found out with me, versus before it was more kind of like, ooh, I'm kind of afraid to approach this person as a teacher.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing is that our experience has been when teachers actually have the autonomy to focus on an area of their practice that's important to them, by paying attention to it, it in fact gets better. We have not had situations where teachers have been working in an area and not seen interesting things and good things happen. You know, I think the other important thing is they're sitting with a professional learning team where everybody has different strengths. And so if things are not working, that's where your colleagues can really begin to help. So if I'm trying to stretch into the green zone, the question is, do I have another teacher who sits on my professional learning team who feels very comfortable and confident there? And I think with that, we can begin to get the support and some suggestions that can really make it go. The other thing I said, the other question was about students, as I heard it, was about students and risk-taking. And at the heart of this, and this is one of the things that we work on really hard with our teachers, at the heart of a lot of kind of issues, especially around risk-taking, there's some kind of fear. There's some reason or some experience that kids have had in the past that are keeping them from wanting to do that. And so the question is, how do we make this thing that feels risky, how do we make it feel safer? How do we take small steps toward what it is that we're trying to do, and not think about one large step, but how do we break those things down? How do we use particular contexts where the stakes are not really high to kind of get started? But again, risk is always associated with fear, and the question is, how is it that we get at that and kind of drive the fear out by doing some active experimentation in those areas?
And the other thing I would add to that, the other piece we heard is that if I want my students to be risk takers or to do something, I have to go first as the teacher. I have to model that for them. So if I want students to do some really personal, expressive writing, then I'm going to do that writing and share that work with him. Or if I want students to exercise their voice and try something, I'm going to be the first one out there modeling that for them so they know what it looks like and they see that I'm willing to take that risk first. So I think with that, we can move through to the next piece.
All right. So the question of support, I think, is really critical in this, and I think it's one of the things that's missing from a lot of professional development. And so the question here is really, how do I get the support that I need to really improve my practice? And the strategy that we're going to talk about here is really grounding the work in a professional learning team. So in terms of getting support, I mean, I think there are the things that we've always talked about. I think principals are really important sources of support, but the problem is in many cases principals have 25 to 50 teachers in their building, and as we talk to principals, especially with what's going on today, they are pulled in so many different directions that it's difficult to provide kind of the level of support that a lot of us need to really move forward. The other thing that a lot of us are kind of used to being exposed to is kind of the PD days where we have somebody from the outside come in. And again, you may have a really great session with great content. The problem is with follow-through and follow-up. And we hear a lot of teachers talking about, I heard a great session and it's something I want to do, but with what happens on a daily basis, you kind of never get to it. So without some way of getting kind of ongoing support, nothing really happens. And then the advantage of a learning team in terms of a network of support is that you meet with them on a regular basis. So what we suggest for folks that are doing this work is you've got to meet once a week for at least 45 minutes. And when you do that, the conversation really becomes an ongoing conversation. And the other thing that teachers talk to us about is there's a very different sense of accountability when I'm meeting with a group of colleagues every week, so that when I say at the end of one meeting, this is what I'm going to do in my classroom next week, I really feel like I need to do that. I need to do that stretching in my classroom so that the next week when I come back and talk, I've got something to talk about in terms of things happening. So I think there are a lot of great advantages to a learning team. But with anything, you've got to have the right kind of focus and the right kind of supports and structures in that to make it work. So in terms of the work that we're doing, we talk a lot about having the right folks kind of on the team. And for us, the right size team is usually 4 to 6 people. Any less than 4 and you don't have enough diversity in the group to really get things going, although we've had groups of 3 that have been somewhat productive. Anytime you get bigger than 5 or 6 people, folks start hiding in the group, and it's hard to really be heard with too many. So having the group size is really important. Having diversity, I think, really matters a lot, and we've really had folks use about every possible kind of grouping of people to kind of make this work, and we've had vertical teams in the same subject areas. We've had horizontal teams with people in different subject areas, and it doesn't seem to matter. And in one district we were working with last year, they actually did teams across schools and very purposefully made sure that people actually taught different subject areas because they wanted the conversation to be about practice. The other thing that we advise to principals when you're getting started in this work is start small. Don't start by saying, we're going to make a mandate here that everybody in our school is going to do this. So what I think works, and I think what often works in schools, is to start with the coalition of the willing and really start with those people that are ready to go. And then if things are working well, they will tell their colleagues, and they'll get their colleagues excited about visiting. About being part of this. And this is exactly how it happened in the district I was just talking about. They started with one team of 4 people in the middle school, and the very next year those people went out and talked to people in the other 2 schools in the district, and they went from 4 people to 27 people the next year, and then they made another big jump the year after that. So really letting the process kind of sell itself is, I think, the key. The other important thing, and that I think is really critical, is in a professional learning team, you have to have someone who's kind of out front. And so we do a training with people that we call lead learners. And their job isn't really to direct the work of the team as much as it is to model what it means to be a learner. And so being open about their practice, understanding kind of the flow of activities that go with this, and being willing to be that person that stands up in the group and says, here's an issue that I'm having with my practice, and here's what I need to work on. So having a person in that kind of designated role becomes really critical, and it's the kind of teacher-leader role that's available that allows teachers to continue to do what they do best, to teach kids, but at the same time to be a leader among their colleagues. In terms of thinking about team meetings, you have to do this on a regular basis if it's going to make any difference. So most folks, they spend about 45 minutes a week, so they may have some team time daily. They use one of their team meetings every week to kind of do this. We've also had teams who've done it every other week and met for about double the time, and that also has worked. And again, the key is you've got to get together on a regular basis. You also have to, at the beginning, get really clear on what the purpose of this is. And one of the activities that these teams do early on is to do an activity around collective commitment. So they talk together about what are the expectations we're going to have for each other. What are the rules and processes? Just exactly the same way that a teacher does with his or her students at the beginning of every year. So getting clear on expectations. We have a whole set of meeting agendas so that you don't have to come to the meeting and wonder what it is that you're doing, and that the focus of the conversation is on practice. It's not on particular kids. It's not on field trips. It's not on all the other kind of bureaucratic things that we have to do as a teacher. It's really on your practice and what it is that you're doing to get better. So as we begin to think kind of back across what we have done, or the work that we're doing, it's really about kind of helping teachers to kind of take charge again of their own development. And around that, we've really talked about 4 strategies here that are really critical, and these strategies are all closely tied together to working in a team. The first strategy is about building a common understanding about what it means to teach at a high level, and that's where we talked a lot about the framework that came out of studying these teachers and these 4 different kind of perspectives and dimensions of great teaching, and then how you can connect those in purposeful ways. The second piece is about your purpose as a group, and in terms of the work that we've done with teachers, I think the thing that's different is we always begin with strengths, a more appreciative look at practice, as opposed to starting with just the weaknesses or kind of a deficit model. The third one is around autonomy and really personalizing your learning, developing individual growth plan for each teacher, but then having those teachers who each have their own thing that they're working on come together on a frequent basis once a week to really talk about, to help them kind of co-construct their learning plans, but also then to get support from each other as they move forward. And then finally, this question of support, I think grounding this work in a professional learning team really brings the right kind of diversity, and it brings a lot of knowledge together that everybody can make use of. I think the greatest tragedy in some of our schools, and we saw this next door to me, was a teacher who was just fabulous. And what tends to happen is that we have great teachers in our schools, but we have no way of kind of getting access to each other. So finding a way of using professional learning teams so that the greatness that's represented in every school, that each of us begins to get access to that. So I think that's the key, and we'd like to open it up and for any other questions that you're there. We did want to remind you that there's a lot more information if you go on this website. You'll see lots of short videos of teachers talking about this work. You'll also see a number of assessments that you can use to think about your practice. and you'll see ways of kind of getting this work started in your building. So with that, I think we'll open it up for some more questions if there are any.
Yes, we do have some now, and I imagine there will be a few more come in. The first one comes from Charles and asks, what experience have you had with professional development being slow and unchallenging, making it difficult for teachers to feel motivated in meetings?
Well, I think as we spent time with these great teachers, one of the things that we heard consistently from them is that traditional kinds of professional development are in most cases is not very valuable. It's not personalized. It tends to be short term. It tends to not have the kind of supports built in that you need. So again, I think the thing that we're hearing over and over again is that unless we find ways to personalize and differentiate professional development the same way that we do with kids, professional development is something that ends up not making a great deal of difference. But I think the other thing is that that we have to recognize is that we have experts in our building. We don't have to go outside to find experts on different aspects of practice, and we've got to begin to find ways of taking advantage of the expertise that's all around us.
The one thing I would add to that as well is, again, thinking about that connection between being flexible and having some boundaries and structure. When we work with teachers, we emphasize the importance of moving at your own pace as a team. So some teams may need to spend more time on a particular topic and feel like they have more discussion around it. Other teams will move forward at a faster rate. So it's not everyone kind of marching forward at the same pace. It's each group taking their own time and understanding how much time they need to spend on a particular topic.
We have another question from Carla, who asks, does this go beyond the Dufour's PLC model, or is it meant to work in concert with it?
Well, I think this can absolutely work in concert with it. I think that the biggest difference is that a lot of the work that Dufour's talks about is really kind of data-centered, and there's no reason to not bring data to this. And a huge part of the work that teachers do once they develop their growth plan and begin to do things in class, the rest of the school year is really about doing things, gathering data about the effects of what it is that you're doing, bringing those things back together to talk. And in some ways, I think the process that we're doing could be used as the foundation for Dufour's process and really getting to those important data conversations, but not just data kind of divorced from practice. It's really connecting your practice and the growth of your practice to the data that come out of that.
Okay, another question, this time from Joanne. She asks, are there any districts using this model for evaluative purposes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I'll say a couple things in here. I know Kate's got some stuff as well. We have, we're from Columbus, Ohio, and Ohio, like most states, has a new teacher evaluation system. What we've seen in the places where they're doing is that it begins to transform the evaluation system. It begins to kind of reposition the role of teachers and principals, and teachers can become much more kind of the guiders of evaluation as opposed to just having it done to them. And I think what we've heard from principals is this takes a load off of their plate and having to kind of figure out what is it that everybody ought to be doing. And it allows them to act much more in a supportive role, so that if I'm doing an evaluation of a teacher and I know that teacher is working on a particular aspect of her practice, the question that comes out of me immediately is, what do you want me to look for when I come into your classroom? How can I support what it is that you're trying to do? So if those things are already in motion, I think it really has the capacity to transform what happens in our evaluation process.
I think Mike pretty much covered all the bases there. I think it's really about thinking about evaluation as one piece of feedback that's coming to the teacher as they continuously work on their practice. So they should be connected in some way. It should be part of the feedback loop versus two separate activities where a teacher's getting evaluated and then separately they're figuring out what to do in their practice. One should be fueling the other.
And we have one last question. This is a follow-up from Carla's earlier, and she asks, aside from actual student improvement, should an accountability product come from your PL team's meeting?
Well, yeah, and again, I think there are all sorts of accountability, and clearly there are, in all the resources that we provide to teachers, there are a number of things that they work on every time they come together, and those resources are there to really support their growth, but they can also give access to other people to those resources as well, so that when they develop their growth plan, that's an obvious piece that comes out of this, and there's an opportunity then for principals to see that, to kind of sign off on that and say that that's important. But there's another, I think, much more important kind of accountability that comes out of this, which is the weekly accountability of doing something in your classroom and coming back to kind of report out on, this is what I've been doing. So I think there are the kind of bureaucratic accountabilities that are kind of built in terms of the work that people actually do, and there are things that, forms that they fill out, and there's a lot of stuff like that. But I think the much more important accountability is that I've got my colleagues here, and each of us has agreed that we're going to go out and do something, and every week we bring back evidence of what it is that we've done.
All right. That's all the time we have for now. If you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to either Kate or Mike at the information you see on the screen. We'd also like to thank Mike and Kate for the time that they took to share all this information with us. We'd also like to thank everyone who attended. And a reminder that a recording of this presentation, as well as the PowerPoints, will be available online, as well as emailed to you tomorrow. Thank you again, everybody, for attending.